Welcome back to Unlapped. Katie George, Nate Saunders, Laurence Edmondson. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, like this video, leave us a comment, and don't forget to subscribe to ESPN for more F1 content. And if you're listening, please hit us with a 5-star review. All right, let's get into it. Post-Brazil. Laz, you were on the ground, although Max Verstappen did not see you in the post-race press conference after he had a historic drive. We'll get to that, of course. He came from P17 to win the Brazilian Grand Prix. The last time we saw this was when Kimi Räikkönen at the Japanese Grand Prix did it in 2005. I thought it was baffling, unbelievable, obviously a testament to being one of the greatest drivers ever that we've seen, and to be able to do it in the rain, the deluge that we saw. How impressive was it watching it unfold on the ground, Laz?
It was remarkable. I mean, it's a crazy weekend because that Sunday we had qualifying in the morning, which went really badly for Max Verstappen. And actually, up to that point, up to Sunday morning when qualifying finished, it seemed like all the momentum was with Lando Norris. Everything was going his way. And then, of course, we came into the weekend off the back of everyone having a dig at Max Verstappen for the way he went racing in Mexico. You know, I think a lot of that was justified. I think the way he went racing in Mexico did deserve those penalties, but he had kind of taken that to heart. There'd been some comments which perhaps went a little bit too far. Damon Hill's comments were everywhere about, you know, that he can't race fairly and all that kind of stuff. And so I think Max, and this is where we get the best from him, was really fired up after that Sunday morning qualifying where red flag had knocked him out in Q2. Basically, I mean, you can go into the ins and outs of what happened there and whether that was right, but he went in there kind of feeling, you know, this is all going against me. And on that first lap, he made up 6 places, and that just set the tone for it. And if you watch his onboard from that opening lap, the way he goes around the outside of turn 3 and is just driving past other cars like they're on the formation lap, it's just crazy. And he has this ability, especially at the circuit, because we saw it in 2016 as well. He has this ability just to find grip in wet conditions that no other driver seems to have the confidence to go and find themselves. And that is just pure natural ability. And that's why this performance was so good. And then, of course, he benefited from the red flag. I mean, we can go into the details of that, but I think everyone saw what happened. You know, he was able to, well, Red Bull took a gamble actually and kept him out on used intermediates, thinking there would be a red flag and he'd get the free tire change. So, you know, bit of luck there, but also Red Bull knew what they were doing. They were gambling for that. And Max had the ability to keep the car on the track on these used intermediates. So that was all part of driver skill as well. And then after that, once he got past Esteban Ocon to the lead, his fastest lap from that race was over a second faster than the next driver. He set 17 fastest laps, and the fastest one was over a second faster than the next driver, which was Lando Norris, his, you know, championship rival. And that for me just kind of underlines everything you need to know about that performance. And he said it was the best of his career, so I'm not going to argue with that.
Okay, not going to argue. Where would you say it ranks just in terms of best drives of all time in the rain?
Well, that's a tough one. Nate and I were talking about this actually yesterday on Monday after the race, and how all the great drivers have these amazing races in the wet. If you look at Ayrton Senna, there was Monaco in 1984, which was really his breakthrough race in a car that should never have been near the front. Finished second, controversially. Could have been first. And then there was Estoril, 1985, Ayrton Senna again, Michael Schumacher, 1996, Lewis Hamilton at Silverstone, 2008. Eight.
I think it was 8.
Yeah, it was 8. And, you know, and these races do stand out. It's almost impossible to compare them, but I think all you have to do is look at the stats in this one. You know, P17 to first, fastest lap by over a second. And, you know, I couldn't compare them directly just because of all the things that go on in a race, but that is absolutely one of the best drives we've ever seen in Formula One, period. And I think the wet drives are always a little bit higher up because it allows the drivers to really showcase the talent they have.
And I think the context made it so special as well. It was special anyway, but it effectively won the championship. And to Laurence's point, all the momentum was stacked against him, and it just flipped the whole narrative of not just that weekend around, but really the last few weeks have been this kind of mounting pressure on him, on Red Bull. It's like, oh, Lando's coming. And at one point, you know, on Sunday morning, you could have predicted that Lando could have been within 1 race win's worth of points nearly of Max, just given where he was. And then suddenly, by the end of the race, it's basically dead and buried. So I think that context as well just elevates it. Without that, it still would have been one of the greats. But I think that elevates it to a really special level. A Turkey 2020, a lot of people compared it to when Lewis won his That would have been his 7th championship. That was similar, somebody stepping up and having a consequential win in the rain. This one felt like Max's, and I agree with him, and I agree with Laurence. It's hard to remember many better. He was just different level. It's one of the few times you see one driver look like they're racing different machinery to the rest. And that's what I think was so striking about it, because it's not like it's a bad field of drivers. There's a lot of talent there. Christian Horner made that point after. So yeah, really special stuff. And you had to almost kind of just sit and watch it and appreciate it at one point on Sunday, forgetting all the work stuff that maybe came off the back of it. It was just like, this is pretty spectacular what we're seeing.
Yeah, I think it's a great point because Lando Norris, obviously, and McLaren had all this momentum leading into the race. And now at this point, because of this epic drive, Max can secure the Drivers' Championship in Vegas, which is in 2 weeks' time. Both of you will be on the ground there. Just circling back to the red flag, Laz, that you mentioned, do you feel like the FIA did right in that situation? What did you think of their process there?
I actually think this whole weekend, the FIA and Formula One working together on getting a race on time. Well, it wasn't actually on time, it was early, but doing that because of the weather concerns. The amount of races where we've turned up and it's been a dry Sunday morning and then they've scheduled the race in the afternoon when everyone knows, a rain shower is going to come or a thunderstorm's going to come. And we just kind of walk into this disaster. I've been there so many times. So to see the FIA and F1 do the sensible thing, shift qualifying to Sunday morning, ridiculously early, 7:30 a.m. I've never been at a qualifying session that early in the day. I thought it was done really well. And then the red flag in the race, I think was absolutely right. I mean, Colapinto was the one that crashed under the safety car. Now, you could argue that, well, because he crashed under the safety car, there should have been a red flag earlier. But I actually think, that was the right call, the right time. I think it was a little bit of Franco Colapinto, very limited experience in wet weather in a Formula One car by that stage. And so, yeah, at that point you had to red flag it. But prior to that, I think getting through that rainstorm, because that rainstorm was forecast to finish, to dry up within about 5 or 6 minutes. It didn't actually play out like that. It kind of got a bit worse, but that's what the forecast was saying. So the FIA to run a safety car through that was probably the fairest way to deal with that situation, because it did become clear at a certain point that racing was dangerous, because the cars just tend to aquaplane. You've got different tires and different state of tires, and that can lead to something really quite nasty. So I think they actually got that call bang on. I think Max was a bit upset about the one in qualifying that I mentioned earlier, but even that, ultimately you just got to deal with the situation as it unfolds. And Stroll was in the barriers. I think clearly it probably was a red flag, but the race control is dealing with so many different things. And then, of course, if they'd done an immediate red flag, there would have been a bunch of drivers that were upset because they were on qualifying laps. So you can't make everyone happy in these situations. And I actually think the whole weekend was dealt with. The fact that we got a sprint race in the dry, and then with some of the worst conditions I've seen at a racetrack this year, I think managed to get qualifying and the race in, and also produce such a spectacle. I think it's testament to actually the FIA getting this one right.
Well, Max was also upset after his epic race because he didn't see a single Brit in his post-race press conference. Not sure if you saw the comment. Of course, you two saw the comments. Nate, I know where you were, but I'm just curious, where do we think Laz was? Because where are all my Brits at?
He was typing out anti-Verstappen tweets, obviously, like all of us do on a day-to-day basis. Yeah. I've got to point out, one of the photographers in there pointed out there were no Dutch journalists in there either. So it wasn't just like all the Brits weren't there. There were no Dutch in there. There was a couple of local journalists and a couple of photographers. Very poorly attended press conference by the sound of it. But Laurence, this is your court case. This is your defense. Where were you?
Yeah. Well, let me kind of explain what happens after race. So the top 3 drivers, they go and do TV interviews first. And then they go through all the TVs from all the different nationalities. And that's because TV pays more money than written journalists who turn up and, write about the sport. And so we have to wait for the top 3 drivers to finish those. And there's no set amount of time. There's no deadline at which they finish it. So we never know when the post-race press conference is going to be. But inevitably, it clashes with team principal press conferences, which are going on in the paddock. So I was at Andrea Stella trying to understand what went wrong with McLaren. Lando, quite understandably, wasn't that willing to talk about anything after the race. So to get that side of the story, it was very important to go and see what Stella had to say. And then Christian Horner, Max's boss, also to kind of, contextualize this victory, understand what was going on from the team side and that decision around the red flag and all of that. Now, if you don't attend those team principal press conferences in the paddock, you don't get hold of that audio because, that's very much a huddle around a table and everyone has their recording device. They record it and that's it. So if you're not there, you don't get it. Whereas the FIA official press conference, and this may seem lazy on our part, but they're going to give us the transcript for that anyway at the end of the day. So if you know those two things are clashing, which they did in Brazil, then you choose the one that you're not going to get hold of unless you're there. If that makes sense. And so I do like attending the top three press conferences because, I think you get a lot of emotion from those top three drivers and you get some really good quotes. So I will try and make them when I can. But the other problem in Brazil, and Max alluded to this, in that perhaps the English or the British journalists can't find the press conference room, is that it's tucked away, nowhere near the media center and also nowhere near the paddock. It's kind of like in this kind of underground bunker. So to try and do all the logistics and get there and not waste too much of your post-race time, which is so precious to understanding what happened in the race so that you can write about it, inevitably you can't do everything. And the other thing is, Nate, I'd like to point out, not that many British journalists made the trip to Brazil.
Yeah, I wasn't there. I wasn't there. So and that was
a lot of the
that was
regulars,
part of it. Yeah.
A lot of the regulars weren't there, and they probably would have gone there, or we would have shared roles. So if Nate and I are both there, one of us says, I'll do the post-race press conference, I'll do the team principals. And so inevitably you can share the load a bit. So just one of those things.
Yeah.
But I did like Max's comment. I did like Max's comment because I think there are certain sections of the press which did go in on him too hard afterwards. I wrote a piece about the penalties he got in Mexico, and I tried to be fair and I tried to explain why they were given, and then this was Red Bull's argument. This is what the FIA said. And I think there's other people that went in a slightly different way. So good on him for kind of, throwing something back at us.
It was a funny moment as well. Christian Horner was talking to to Sky on, in the hours after, and Hill said, "Oh, it was a great drive," and Horner said, "Oh, it's lovely to hear some nice stuff from Damon. Do you want to keep going?" And there was a funny, and you could see Hill found that quite awkward. And I agree with Laurence. Out of all of the pundits that have, I suppose, stuck their neck out about Max recently, there's been a lot of fair things said, but I think, what he said was just a bit too generalized and a bit too sweeping a statement. So I think Laurence alluded to it earlier. When Max is in that kind of mood, maybe people need to rile him up a little bit more, because if we get those performances every few weeks, that seems to be the catalyst. So yeah, he clearly had a point to prove, didn't he, all weekend? But just to clarify, I felt like I was throwing Laurence under the bus there. I obviously understood where Laurence was because I was talking to him. And in Mexico, the funny thing is, the week before in Mexico, it was just myself, but the layout point Laurence makes is a really good one, because there the press conference room is right next to the media center, and all of the hospitality units are just basically outside there. So it's like it's a very quick, breezy walk, and there's a lot more people there. You can kind of say, hey, if I go to the top three, do you mind covering Christian, Fred or whatever? So a lot more of that going on. And we'll have the reverse in Vegas, won't we? Because in Vegas, there's so many journalists there, it's impossible to miss a session.
You guys are going to be able to divide and conquer, especially if Max is able to secure the Drivers' Championship in Las Vegas. To that point, McLaren, obviously, as we mentioned, had a lot of momentum. It looked like it was going to be a special weekend after winning the sprint race following a driver switch with teammate Oscar Piastri for Lando Norris, that is. And then Lando started the race on pole. Andrea Stella said, after the fact that, Constructors' Championship was always the priority. So this doesn't change anything. And McLaren, obviously, very much in position to still be able to win the Constructors. But what did you make, Laz, of just McLaren's weekend and how everything ended up for the team in general?
Well, it was going so well, up to the sprint race. They got a 1-2 there. They managed to execute the team orders to ensure that Lando took the extra point over Oscar Piastri. They did try. They did try really hard. And Lando, of course, got pole position in that wet qualifying session. Again, everything looked like it was going the right way. But the odds were always stacked against Lando. And it was always the case with these remaining races that one error, one mistake, one bit of bad luck, and the whole thing could fall apart. And, that's essentially what happened in the race. I think we shouldn't highlight too much McLaren getting it wrong so much as Max getting it right. Everything we just talked about how good Max Verstappen was. I think that's the reason that he's secured the title almost going into Las Vegas. But if you look at Lando's race, he also knew that one mistake in those conditions, which is so easy to make, we saw Lance Stroll go off on the formation lap. We saw all those 5 drivers crashing qualifying. One mistake like that by Lando, which is so easy in those conditions, and it all would have been over anyway. So, he lost the position at the start, but kept his calm behind Russell, made that pit stop, got ahead. And I think, at that stage, if the scenario I was talking about earlier, where they hadn't needed the red flag, maybe Colapinto hadn't gone into the wall and they'd just run under the safety car, and Red Bull's and Alpine's gamble on this red flag happening didn't happen, then all of a sudden Lando would have been in a great position, because when he came out of the pits, we talk about Max Verstappen going a second faster than everyone else. When he came out of the pits after his pit stop before the red flag, that little brief period of racing where he overtook Russell, he was, I think it was 1.2 seconds faster in the middle sector alone than Max was. So you could see the way that the race was going if it had been allowed to continue in those conditions. And even with the safety car, because Max didn't make that initial pit stop under the safety car. So if they'd then changed their mind midway through, once the pack was all bunched up, then Max would have dropped way, way, way back. So it's these little things, these little kind of moments in a season that we've seen so often before. Go back to Abu Dhabi, Nicholas Latifi's crash, towards the end of the race, and the little things that can just change a championship completely out of a driver's control. And they just have to deal with what comes next. And, I think Lando was pushing very hard at the end. Andrea Stella said that he didn't really go into the details as to why, but he said the car was very sensitive under braking, so it's very easy to lock up in those conditions. And he kind of indicated that was a mistake that the team had made in terms of setup, in terms of the way the car just is in wet conditions. And so Lando had those 2 lockups where he just went wider turn 1 under restarts. But that just showed you how hard he was pushing. So tough one for Lando, but like we said so many times before, he kind of entered this championship through the back door a bit, kind of able to just put together some results and just try and make this happen. But it was always reliant on everything going his way. And in Brazil, it just flipped back the other way. So, I think I'm not saying that Lando was kind of, it was luck that was involved. I think Max absolutely went out and won it. But I think if you look at Lando's race, it was unfortunate the way everything came about.
I want to give a certain team their flowers, because I think it's been maybe like a year since we've talked about Alpine on this podcast. No, it hasn't been that long. We've usually talked about
probably pushing it
as of late. How about Alpine? I mean, double podium, took them from P9 to P6 in the constructors. I don't know if this was a one-off, Nate, or if this is a sign to come, or if they just needed oars and paddles and their car actually is a boat instead of a race car. I was very impressed with Alpine, and of course, none of us on this podcast saw it coming based on our predictions. All of us were incorrect on all 3 predictions. So what did you think of Alpine's?
Yeah, can't believe we didn't put the Alpine drivers down for a podium.
I know. How do we not see it coming?
I mean, unbelievable performance. And a lot was made after the race and I think Lando got hard done by a little bit because the quote was taken out of context, but him saying, oh, it's just luck when something like that happens, and, with safety cars. But Max's performance was incredible, but Alpine's result was a great example of seizing those moments in Formula One that just happened to present themselves. There's no one in a million years would have put money on that result in dry conditions. You'd have been mad to have done so. I think it was Pierre who joked after the race. It's like, well, it was hard to make our car slower in the dry, so the rain kind of helped level things out, and that is often the case. The rain does bring all these cars together. It just makes things. It just makes the kind of the normal pecking order you get in the dry is suddenly thrown out a little bit. We saw the AlphaTauri drivers both up at the front end at one point as well, and they just drifted away. It was just a really well executed race, and I was surprised they followed the Red Bull gamble as well with both cars, because they were in such a good position. I thought the way to play that would be, right, we're going to pit one of you, keep one of you out, and then that way, regardless of how this race shakes out, we've got one car that has made the gamble that will or won't pay off, and we've got one car that played it safe, which did or didn't play off. So for them to have rolled the dice, maybe they're already thinking about Vegas. It was very much a roll the dice and just put everything on black and see what happens. And it was and it came off. It was fantastic to see. And it's funny, actually, I was in the Alpine garage for FP1 in Mexico. So I was talking to a few of their guys, really, really nice guys working at that team, which is the case for most of the teams there. And you forget often that a lot of these teams have got people who have worked in Formula One for years and years and years, and they often have to sit and watch other teams celebrating, and they hear other teams when they're packing down, they're wearing their victory shirts, or they're all covered, they've been spraying each other with champagne, and they're like, great, we finished 15th and 16th again. It's kind of hard for them to keep coming back to that. So
Sure.
I messaged one of them actually, who I was speaking to after that race, and he said, I can't believe it. He's like, it's like dreamland scenario for us. He said everything we did just was perfect. He said if you make 100 calls in a race, sometimes you expect 50 of them to come off well. He's like, literally everything we did from the beginning of that day to the end came off. That's not going to happen every week for Alpine. I think there's luck, and I think luck sometimes it feels loaded, doesn't it? It feels like you're trying to take credit away from people. But that was a great example of a team making their own luck, putting themselves in the right position, making the right calls. Ocon and Gasly, both fantastic drives from both of them to secure that result. Great story as well, those two guys, everything they've been through, the friendship, it's been rocky since then, and they've kind of become friends again, I think, since. It just had everything you would want from a team story. And Alpine, I mean, a couple of months ago, we were writing, what is next for this team? they're selling, they've sold off their engine department. They brought back Flavio Briatore, who's this kind of disgraced, former figure from Crashgate back in the day. They've just brought in the youngest team boss of all time. They've got a rookie team boss in Ollie Oakes. So really, there's been a lot of question marks around that team, and those questions still exist. The longer term doubts over Alpine are still there, but this kind of result, if you're, Renault now, when Luca De Meo goes to the board at Renault, he has this he can go to and say, look, not everything is doom and gloom. We have this great result. It will, I think it will just kind of supercharge that team behind the scenes. Whether it fixes anything in the long term, I don't think individual results do that, but you felt that from a morale point of view, that team needed that kind of result. So to have done it, and to have done it as well it was on merit. They did make some calls that came their way, but they made calls other teams weren't willing to make, and they were already in good positions before they did that. So really great to see. And I have to admit, I was worried when Max got past Ocon. I thought, I really don't want to see the two Alpines just drop down the order now, slowly, because there's like 20 laps left still, wasn't there? But they stayed right up there. It was remarkable to see. So really great result. And I think that podium was, it just every single person on there. It's one of the few times you see all three people delighted to be there. You've always got one guy who's like, oh, I'm second. I should have been first. Or third is like, oh, I should have been second. Or one guy's like, oh, my team didn't let me race my teammate. This was perfect. They were every single person was as happy as you're going to see them on the podium. So really great to see. And a long time coming for Alpine, because I think their last podium visit was, I think Gasly got one last year, maybe. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head.
Yeah.
But a double podium they hadn't
ago.
had since the Enstone team was called Lotus in 2013, which is pretty remarkable.
Well, you mentioned the personal history between the two, and they seemed very positive and friendly towards one another after the fact. If you want to read more about that, Nate has a great article right now on ESPN.com. But flowers are given to Alpine for what was a phenomenal weekend or race in Brazil. I do want to touch on two more things before we head out. Laz, Yuki Tsunoda is not usually mentioned when it comes to replacing Sergio Perez, whether that's fair or not. We can have that debate another time. But Liam Lawson, obviously, in that role for Daniel Ricciardo, his name's been thrown around as Sergio Perez continues to struggle. Between Yuki and Liam, is it becoming more likely that one of them will end up taking Perez's seat here in the near future?
So each weekend, this whole situation at Red Bull seems to change slightly one way or another. The music changes. I mean, undoubtedly, Perez is under a lot of pressure and remarkably has found himself on track fighting against Liam Lawson at the last two races, which does not...
Who absolutely loves it as well, doesn't he? He seems to relish those moments brilliantly.
I mean, it's a perfect scenario for Liam. I mean, he's there trying to prove to Red Bull, look, I'm the guy you want to replace Perez. I can get the job done. And Perez is doing such a bad job that a car that, in Max's hands is a second faster than everyone else, in Checo's hands is racing against RBs. And so that doesn't look good. And then, we talked a little bit about McLaren prioritizing the Constructors' Championship. Well, Red Bull simply have not been able to do that in the second half of the season because of Checo's results. And so really, it did seem like there was, this period left where he needs to get his act together. I mean, there's so many other things going on, the money that Checo brings to the team and also, his standing in Mexico and everything that is good about having Checo within a team. And there's a lot there. And it's not just money wise, you know, he's a great guy as well. And when he performs, it's all rosy and brilliant, but he's not at the moment. And ultimately, you know, I think Red Bull, they know that they're going to be they're in a tough fight this year. Okay, they're going to get away with the Drivers' Championship because of the brilliance of Max Verstappen. But going into next year, you know, that's definitely not guaranteed. And so from a constructor's point of view, you really need two drivers that are doing a job. And so, I mean, I've said from the start, would love to see Yuki in that role. I think, you know, he's the one that is kind of best prepared for it. He's done the most seasons at the junior team of all the potential candidates. And so I think he would be the obvious one to go forward. It seems like Red Bull don't quite agree with that, but perhaps he's going to get the test in Abu Dhabi, so might just be able to tip the scales his way. Lawson, I think, would be a great contender. I'd love to see him in it. Like Nate said, he doesn't seem to care about, you know, who he's going up against, what the situation is. So I think that's really what you need if you're going to be Max Verstappen's teammate. And then the other intriguing storyline that's bubbling away in the background is whether Red Bull can make a move for Franco Colapinto, buy him out of his Williams contract and find a place for him, probably in RB if Lawson goes up to Red Bull, and everything around that. And I think in my mind, that would be the ideal situation, because as much as I like Checo, you know, I think the results just mean that it's hard to make a case for him to stay up the top team or one of the top teams in Formula One. Whereas someone like Colapinto, if he's not on the grid next year, I think that's going to be brutally unfair, because, you know, this weekend aside, where there were some mistakes, the kind of mistakes you would absolutely expect of a rookie driver, especially if he came in midway through the season, I think his potential and his ability behind the wheel deserves a place on the grid next year. So that would be my ideal scenario. But as I said, like every time you talk to Christian Horner, we talked to him after the race, because I wasn't at the Max Verstappen press conference, but I was talking to Christian. And you know, and then he gone very cold on the whole idea of Colapinto, you know, and he wasn't giving anything away. His cards were really close to his chest. But we also learned from James Vowles earlier in the weekend that he'd been round to Williams for coffee to talk about this, essentially, even though Vowles said it went there to talk about the coffee, but we know what you said, going there to talk about. So I think all of that is very interesting and really hanging in a balance right now as to who's going to end up where. But Checo's seat is absolutely under threat.
I think the Colapinto thing's interesting as well. Just to add to that, is one of the things we always hear about Perez is there's a huge amount of backing that Red Bull get from the Mexican side there with him. It's not the only reason, but I think that's a significant part of why Perez stays there. I'm still baffled that they signed him to an extension this year, because that has really put them in. Let's just back them into a corner they didn't need to be in. If they hadn't done that, this would be a really, you know, they could hold that over Perez. Like, you know, you haven't signed for next year, whatever. I think bringing Colapinto in would give them the chance to promote Lawson or Tsunoda, as Laurence said, but also there's just so much interest from South America that's coming in. I'm not sure it would rival the commercial kind of benefits that you get from Perez and Mexico, but that's a really untapped kind of market at the moment. The excitement for Colapinto is genuinely incredible. I mean, the amount of, they don't even have a race in Argentina, and you can see Argentinian flags and shirts at every race now. That's only going to get bigger. You know, you can imagine there being an Argentinian Grand Prix down the line if that continues. So from a commercial point of view, I know fans sometimes hate that being brought up, but it is a big consideration for things like this. I think that really makes Colapinto an attractive option, because I don't think Red Bull are fully committed to promoting either of their two young drivers just yet. I think they could if they wanted to, but Colapinto is kind of a get out of jail free card for kind of, this guy's proven himself already in Formula One. We know he's got the marketing capability. We know that he's going to be a popular driver, and you've got two guys there. It's basically then which guy do you then put up alongside Perez? So if I was making that call, Colapinto would be the obvious choice, but obviously I'm not, and it's probably a good reason I'm not. But it does seem, from people I've spoken to, it seems like Red Bull are, even though Christian was coy about it on Sunday, I think that's now becoming their preferred option. But I can imagine him going to the junior team just to keep his kind of learning process going, because Red Bull straight away for him, I think, would just be too much too soon.
Laz, I don't know if you were around Lewis Hamilton for his post-race comments, as you were avoiding Max Verstappen, clearly, like the play. I'm just kidding, of course. But he had some, I think, intriguing comments about beating teammate George Russell and getting to next year. Like, did you feel like it was ominous in the fact that maybe like he's kind of given up on Mercedes at this point? I mean, I know we're almost to the end of the year and his, future at Ferrari is coming closer, but I just thought his post-race comments were a bit interesting.
Yeah, well, and one of the great things about talking to drivers immediately after the race is that they're still emotionally charged. There's still some adrenaline pumping through their veins, and so they say stuff that maybe they wouldn't say in a more considered environment. But you do get a little glimpse of the truth, and it does seem that Lewis was so upset with the way his car handled throughout the weekend. It's a very bumpy surface, even though it's been relayed at Interlagos, and that really didn't suit the Mercedes, certainly in the way that Lewis had it set up. And so I think he'd had a horrible race, bouncing around in wet conditions, cars skipping all over the place. And he basically said, look, it doesn't really matter to me anymore, any of this. It doesn't matter if I beat George or not. I think George has just overtaken him in the drivers' standings. And he said he's just looking forward to Christmas. And then, of course, we know what happens after Christmas. He goes to Maranello and gets a brand new car and a brand new team. So I think that's genuine. That it did come from a place, but I think perhaps maybe, I think he is also savoring these moments with Mercedes and with that team. There's a lot of people in that team that he's very close to, and that he wants to make the most of these last few races. And look, if he could have a car that was up there competing for podiums and victories, obviously he would prefer that. If he could beat George, I'm sure somewhere deep down that would give him some satisfaction in their final season as teammates. But yeah, I think when he's had a weekend as bad as the one in Brazil, then yeah, I think really it was just a kind of case of, I'm done with this. I want to move on to the next period. And it must be tough as well, because everything that you do for this team right now isn't really benefiting you going into the future. So I think all of that is knocking around his head. And yeah, after a race like Brazil, it does sometimes spill out to the media as well.
And Lewis has always kind of been like that, hasn't he? And I don't mean this in a bad way, but I think he's always, the emotions are always right there on the sleeve with Lewis. And I think sometimes he finds it difficult to convey frustration. Some drivers just come in, like you can see, like on the other side of the scale, you've got like a Lance Stroll, it doesn't give you any emotion either way. And you're like, okay, great. Thanks for that, Lance. Great interview. Lewis comes in, and often you can see he's struggling with what he wants to say. He's obviously got something bubbling away in his head that he wants to get out, but then he realizes, like, I don't want to throw the team under the bus, but I do want to say this. And I've always found Lewis quite compelling, but even with that, I found those comments quite confusing. And you could see from the TV interviews that I watched, you could see the cogs turning in his head, and he was almost trying to work out what he was saying as he was saying it. Which I think is interesting. But it has been you don't see that situation much, do you? A guy driving for a team for a whole season, knowing he's leaving. It's pretty rare. We saw a couple of drivers do the same thing in COVID. Remember, Ricciardo and Sainz switched teams at the end of that first season, and both of them said how awkward it was to kind of be driving for that team towards the end of the year, because more and more the conversation turns to what we're doing next year, and they're kind of like, okay, are you staying in the room, or are you, are you gonna get out of here? So it must just be a weird situation. And also couple all of that with the fact that earlier that day, the day before, I think it was, or was it between the qualifying and the race? Lewis had this incredible emotional high of driving the Senna car. So I think there's a lot of emotion bubbling away for him. But yeah,
I'd say the other side to it that we saw earlier this year is when he won at Silverstone, and then it was this beautiful emotional moment with the team. And, it's so important that I won this race with the team that, I had all this success with. So it goes both ways. And I think it really is result dependent. So I think a lot of the stuff he said, you shouldn't read too much into, like, there's all this chaos at Mercedes and, or they're kind of unfairly working with George over Lewis. I don't think that's the case. And I very much doubt, although I don't know for certain, but I very much doubt that he really thinks that. I think it is just that immediate emotions after getting out of a car that completely, like you say with Lewis, is so compelling, because you get kind of exactly what he's thinking, whereas with other drivers, they manage to conceal it all.
When Lance Stroll starts taking stray bullets, that's when we end the podcast.
He drove straight into a gravel trap, Katie. So he deserves all the stray bullets he's getting on this.
I know. It's
I can see you smiling as I name dropped you.
It'd be surprising if Laz was the one to say it, but not you. On that note, Laz, safe travels. Nate has a fridge to install. Enjoy your weekends off. And then we cannot wait to see you in Las Vegas for our next round of Formula One. As always, thank you guys for watching. Thank you for listening to Unlapped. We'll see you next week. Cheers.